Let's name the elephant in the room, shall we? Revelation is tough, isn't it? It's tough for a variety of reasons, not least of which are the symbols and the images and the figures that are offered to us in the pages of this vision that sometimes reads like a letter. It's tough. We get beasts, we get locusts, we get dragons and other things. Oh my. And the images make this text difficult because different images mean different things to different people in different times and different places. To illustrate, imagine I brought with me an image of an eagle to put on the screen. I guess we could have done that, but we didn't. So you can imagine it. Let's go ahead and say it's a bald eagle. And take for a moment to consider what emotions or other feelings or attitudes that you would experience if we were to put a picture of a bald eagle on a screen. Chances are, if you're from this country, if you're not, imagine a flag of your own nation. Chances are you would feel some sort of civic pride or American identity. That's what happens when we see symbols that remind us of where we're from or that mark the identity of the society in which we are members. You might feel some kind of pride. You might feel a sense of honor. You might feel some civic duty or something like that. That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Now take for a moment that same image, an eagle, and imagine we showed it to someone who lived in Judea, maybe not far from Jerusalem. And consider what sorts of emotions or experiences that person would have, man or woman, looking at the same image. Would they experience national pride, civic honor, perhaps duty, positive emotions that they lean into? Not on your life. They would more likely experience fear, terror, some sort of anxiety, and if there were anything like what we might call patriotism, it would be for their own nation against what that symbol represented. Why? Because in the first century, around the Mediterranean, the eagle was a symbol of the Roman Empire. And if you happened to live in one of the lands they happened to occupy, you wouldn't appreciate that symbol very much, would you? You would be doggedly opposed to everything it meant, including Rome's imperial power, their strength, their military force, their power to conscript, their power to levy taxes, all of those things. We lean into this because it helps us see that different symbols mean different things to different people in different times and places. All of the symbols in Revelation come to us from the first century, primarily from the Jewish worldview. And so when we read them, no one's from the first century, right? When we read them, we are immediately faced with the problem that they come from a very different cultural space. And we do not have the benefit of growing up in that ancient Judean, Hebrew culture, worldview, mindset, all of those things. And so when we come to these texts and we see these images and beasts and dragons and seals and blood and all these things, then all kinds of crazy stuff happens. Wild books get written, ungrounded in any serious biblical theology. One scholar said there are as many interpretations of Revelation as there are interpreters. Because if our reading is grounded in our context, there's a really good chance we're going to miss what it means. So one of the reasons Revelation is so difficult, there are others, is because so many of the images had very specific and clear meanings to people who lived in the first century. And they're just not clear to us, unless you happen to have a degree in classics. And if you do, maybe we'll have coffee and you can even help me as I prepare for this sermon. And what happens is that we get caught up in the particulars of the image, playing guessing games about what they could possibly mean or who that might possibly refer to or which chapter are we even in, and miss the point of this surprising, sometimes disturbing, always beautiful text. Because the point of Revelation isn't the images. The point of Revelation isn't the symbol. The point of Revelation isn't the various figures. They're all important, but they're important in the way they serve the main point. There's one thing that Revelation is trying to do. And if we get distracted by the secondary things that serve the one thing, well, we'll wind up probably reading really bad fiction or commentaries or listening to bad sermons. If you want to be able to understand the Revelation, and we're going to spend the better part of this year working through it carefully, then you must be vigilantly undistracted from the main point of the vision as a whole. And here it is. Revelation is a vision of Jesus that calls for faithfulness to Jesus. And you think, that's it? Isn't that too simple for such a complicated text? Surely there's more to it. I've read about the beast, and I've read about the woman and all the plagues and the tribulations, and surely there's more to it than that. Isn't that too simple for such a complicated text? The answer is no. It's quite simple. There's one thing this entire document is aiming to do. It is aiming to make known Jesus. And in making him known, it calls all of us and everyone who's ever read it to trust him, to be faithful to him, and to offer him our unqualified allegiance. Revelation is a vision of Jesus. It calls for faithfulness to Jesus. Now, before we get into the particulars of that, we will in the first chapter, there's a couple of guiding principles, you might call them, for helping us read this text. Maybe these are like guardrails. They'll just keep us on the road, because if you're reading a text like this, you sure don't want to run off in the ditch. So here's the first one. Revelation should always, always, always be interpreted in a way that its original readers would have understood. This letter is addressed to people. We just read some of their churches. Pergamum, Smyrna, Ephesus. The whole thing is actually written so that if you were to look at the map of these churches, look at these cities on a map, the document could travel one to another in this direction without ever backtracking, and it'd get to each one of these communities. So this is a thing that's written to real people who lived real lives, who are participating in real churches under the threat of a real empire, and they understood it because it drew on images that they were familiar with. And so our reading of it shouldn't sound strange to them. It should seem familiar. And we should read it in ways that the original recipients would have thought, oh yeah, that's right. That's what's going on there. It's a real letter addressed to real people. The question is, what did it mean to them? And we have to answer that question before we can begin to consider how we appropriate it and apply it in our own day. Again, the symbols are strange to us, but not to them necessarily. Let's take the image of the beast, for example. Everybody knows about the beast, right? Later on in Revelation, there's actually two beasts, one from the land, one from the sea. We'll just talk about one for now. I'm doing a little opposition research for this sermon series. That means that I'm reading people I disagree with to see, just to make sure that I understand how wrong they are. Now, it's always good to read people who you disagree with, and it's striking. One of the things one of the first things I saw as I'm reading through this is on the table of contents of this book is the claim, you've got the beast, and then in parentheses it was the Antichrist. Now that struck me as a little peculiar because the one word, well, there are a lot of words, but one of the words that never appears in the book of Revelation is Antichrist. And if it happens to be written by the same John who wrote the letters of John, then it's a word he knew, because that's where it appears in the 6 times that it shows up in the New Testament, often in the plural, multiple antichrists. So work that into your eschatology. John never claims that the beast is an antichrist. That's a speculative move that is unfounded when it comes to these texts. And it has resulted in people claiming that all sorts of figures happen to be the beast or the Antichrist. Back in the day, it was Henry Kissinger. In every century, it's been the Pope, from one perspective or another. More recently, I've seen some search terms on the web. Is Elon Musk the Antichrist? But that image isn't inviting us to play guessing games, is it? The image of a beast to a Jewish person in the first century wasn't confusing. It was quite clear. They knew, because they had grown up reading Daniel, that when you get biblical texts with these wild-looking creatures, head of this, body of that, wings of the other, face like all these different terrifying conglomerations, like you try to come up with the scariest thing you can, and the Bible will one-up you. And all the way through, they are explicitly said to represent what? Pagan nations that oppose and oppress the people of God. Whether it's Persia or Rome, doesn't matter. They're like beasts. And if you're a Jewish person in the first century, you're not speculating about who the beast is. You know who the beast is. The beast is Rome, with Caesar at its head. That's uncontroversial. It's clear. It's a quite straightforward reading of this text. So the question then becomes for us, not is it the Secretary of State or something else, but what are the powers and forces, organizations, companies? What are the entities in our world that tend to embody those kinds of behaviors, postures, that skewed character that opposes the purposes of God in the world, perhaps at an institutional level? Is that not what beasts look like from the perspective of the Revelation? All of a sudden, if we read this text the way the first Christians read it, it makes a great deal of sense. It's well grounded theologically, and it gives us a lens through which to read our culture. So we want to get into the mindset, the worldview, the images of the Jewish frame of reference in the biblical period, and that will help us understand this text. So our first principle, we want to read it the way people in Ephesus and Smyrna read it. Secondly, It is a revelation of Jesus. We'll get to that in a minute. It is not a revelation of things that you'll read in the newspaper. It is not a history book of future events. That, again, when I was doing my Oppo research, believe it or not, I expected to find things I disagreed with. I didn't expect it to be in literally the first sentence of the first paragraph of the preface of the book. That's where it was. And the guy says, this is a fascinating book because it is a detailed description of future events. And I thought, we read this differently, don't we? There's very good evidence that you shouldn't even read this chronologically. Here's an example. When we get on into the heavenly vision, in chapter 6, we'll read about a set of seals that you close up a scroll with. You probably already know that there's only one figure in the whole vision who is qualified or worthy to open those seals. It is Jesus, the Lamb, who stands at the center of the throne of heaven. And he starts opening these seals. The Lamb does. And John sees different scenes as the seals are opened. The first thing he sees is a rider on a white horse. White in Revelation is always symbolic of the people of God, the righteous ones, and here it's the Messiah. So the first thing he sees, the Messiah. Could that possibly suggest the preeminence of the Messiah in whatever else is about to happen? Absolutely it does. After that, he sees 3 more riders, and they are representative of the wicked state of affairs that the world has experienced from Genesis to now. Death, war, injustice, poverty, all the things that keep us awake at night, that terrify us, that frustrate us, that scare us, all of the things. You get a vision of the Messiah, and then you get a vision of just the absolute mess of things. Then the next seal is open, and you see a vision of martyrs. They're gathered under the throne of God or around the throne of God. They are quite perturbed, and they're waiting for their vindication. So you've got Messiah, you've got all the bad stuff, you've got the implications of the bad stuff. The faithful people are dead. And then with the 6th seal, there's a great earthquake. The sun turns black. The moon turns blood red. Stars start falling out of the sky. It's a pretty fantastic vision. And there's an image of the judgment. And the kings of the earth cry out, we'd rather have the rocks fall on us than face the wrath of the Lamb. So the 6th seal, acknowledging all the stuff that's come before, insists on the reality of God's just response to all of the wickedness. You've got the Messiah, you've got the judgment of the Lamb, and they bookend everything that's wrong with the world as a way of insisting the one who is, who was, and who is to come will make it right. It's a zoomed out, big picture, 30,000-foot view of the whole of history, of everything. And then in chapters 8 and 9, when you get to the trumpets, everything zooms in to the judgment, the 6th seal. It's like John is going, hey, there's a lot going on with that 6th seal, more than I've said back in chapter 6. So we're going to devote significant space in 8 and 9 with these trumpets and the angelic blasters of the trumpets to give you a better sense of the justice of God in response to everything that's wrong with the world. So if you read some things that are out there, it's, well, you've got the seals, and that's one time period, that's one chronology, and then after that you've got the trumpets, and that's more tribulation or judgment or something, and you better hope you got raptured out or whatever. That's another word that's not in Revelation. Rapture. And it's a timeline. That's how it's read. But that's not what's going on, is it? It's big picture, zoomed out, preeminence of Jesus and sovereignty of God over everything that has wrecked his world. It may not be obvious right now, but it's coming. He will put it right. And John says that's important enough that we are going to zoom in on the he will put it right part. And we're going to do these 7 trumpets to clarify and add more detail. We'll look at it from this angle, then we'll step over here, and we'll look at it from that angle, then we'll step over here, and we'll look at it from this angle. Not because you've got to figure out which trumpet is happening right now. That's a lost cause. Because you need to know how deeply the triune God is committed to putting his world right. And if you were a believer in the first century who was worried about Rome and people like Nero who would use the burning bodies of Christians to light the way in his garden, if you were worried about people like that, then it really matters a lot that the Messiah shows up first and the Lamb has the last word. It really matters a lot that God is committed to vindicating the martyrs. It really matters a lot that he will judge the enemies of his people. And it is always, always, always the Lamb who is executing the actions of God. So again, these aren't chronological records. This isn't a history book of future events. We're not meant to sort of pull out the newspaper and look at wildfires in California and go, obviously that's the 3rd trumpet. That's not how it works. That's not how this text functions. That's not the point at all. The whole thing is intended to communicate in these scenes of judgment and vindication the deep implications of the cross of Jesus, the beauty of his redemption, and the righteousness of his work in the world. Revelation kind of pulls back the curtain so that in a world that is racked with terrifying things and terrifying people, you get a glimpse of the sovereignty and the preeminence of the one who will make it right. So we won't be doing a lot of chronology. Yes, there are things predicted in this document that have yet to happen. One of them is the new creation, and we long for that. But it's not our job to write the future history book, is it? And we'd be missing the point of the text if we did. So he said we need to read it the way the original readers read it. We haven't even got to the sermon yet, by the way. This is still like preliminary stuff, prologue even. It's a revelation of Jesus, not a history book of the future. And then the third thing is just this. Think of Revelation as a theological commentary on the preeminence of Jesus, his death and resurrection, in relation to all the crazy stuff that's happening in the world. It's about Jesus. Again and again and again, the document is about Jesus. And because it's about Jesus, it should lead us to ask 2 questions, and we'll ask these questions all the way through. Number 1, what does this part of the vision teach me about Jesus? That thing with the beast? What does that teach me about Jesus? You're telling me, John, that the beast with the head of one animal and the fierce body of another and the paws and the wings, you're telling me that ferocious, stunning, powerful, funded, wicked thing is subject to a lamb that looks like it's had its throat slit? John says, yeah, that's exactly what I'm telling you. That's what this is about. Then we're invited to ask the question, if that's what Jesus is about, what are we about? What does faithfulness to Jesus look like in light of what this says about him? What does faithfulness to Jesus look like in light of all of the claims made about him in this book? And that's a question we'll ask again and again. It is about him. It reveals him. And that point is made in the first 5 words of the document. The revelation from Jesus Christ. Said earlier, some of your translations may say revelation of Jesus Christ. Really cool thing about Greek syntax is it's both. The vision is of Jesus, and we know it's of Jesus because who's the first person John sees? Jesus. Jesus is the content of the vision. In fact, the whole thing could be divided up into a couple of sections where you get this vision of Jesus in chapter 1 and then a heavenly vision of Jesus later. Revelation is notoriously difficult to outline. In fact, if you're looking for a good time this week, try to outline it, see what happens. But you've got this earthly vision at the very beginning where he's on Patmos and he sees Jesus. And then later on, he's transported to heaven and he sees Jesus, but he looks like a lamb. And then for chapter after chapter after chapter, the lamb is doing stuff. He's acting. So you've got a vision of Jesus here, chapters 1, 2, and 3, and then another vision of Jesus, chapter 4, on into the end of it. But it's all about Jesus. He is the content of this ancient vision. And he's the source of it. It's entrusted to him by God, who he's identified with. And then he offers it to John for the church. These 7, it's important to remember that all the numbers in Revelation symbolize something. And if you're a Jewish person in the first century and you see the number 7, knowing there are more than 7 churches north of the Mediterranean there, there's not just 7, there's more than that. The archaeologists have unearthed a lot of them. They are representative of the whole church. That number 7 in the Jewish mind has to do with complete fullness. This is about the whole church. It's for them. It's written to them, but it's for all of us. So what does it tell us about Jesus? In the opening verses, John tells us about who Jesus is, and he tells us about what Jesus has done. Grace, peace to you from him who is, who was, and who is to come. From the 7 spirits. A lot of translations some translations may render that 7-fold spirit. Again, it's a way of talking about the fullness of the Spirit of God in this vision of nothing is hidden here. This is this full revelation of God, Father, Son, and the fullness of the Spirit. 7 spirits before his throne. And from Jesus Christ. And then we're told 3 things about Jesus. Number 1, he's a faithful witness. Number 2, he's firstborn from the dead. And number 3, he's ruler of the kings of the earth. Let's talk about that faithful witness thing for a second. If you're going to read Revelation, you need to know 1 or 2 things about the Greek language. Number 1 is that the word translated witness could have been translated martyr. It's the word. It's the same word. When we read about martyrs later, it's witnesses. So Jesus here is framed as a faithful martyr. So immediately, one of the first things that we hear about him is this vision of his death, his martyrdom. The New Testament doesn't always frame the death of Jesus, the cross, in terms of martyrdom. We talk about the death of Jesus a lot, for our sins, substitute, but John here wants to say, you need to think about this as a faithful person who went to his death for what was right, and he wasn't guilty. That shouldn't surprise us because he's writing to people who know folks who've been martyred. And he wants them to know the next thing he says about Jesus. He's the firstborn from the dead. Like if you've been slaughtered unjustly because of your testimony to Jesus, then you need to know about the resurrection of the body, don't you? Because that's the only way an unjust capital punishment gets overturned. The martyr gets raised. And Jesus isn't just one of the martyrs raised from the dead. He's the firstborn from the dead, isn't he? Which means what? There are more to come. So as Christians read this document and they get on into chapter 6 and they read about the martyrs before the throne of God, they know the first martyr has already been raised. And that means what? It means the rest of them will be too. So immediately, we are brought face to face with the deep implications of the death and resurrection of Jesus. John wants us to know that Revelation is a gospel document. And the whole thing is intended to help us see into the person and work of Jesus. This is what he has done for his church. The whole purpose is to help us see Jesus and see what he's done, see how he's at work, not in the same old ways that we normally think about it. Those are not bad, they're good, they're crucial. But he wants us to look further into the implications of who Jesus is and what he's done. He wants us to look more closely. He wants to invite us to see things from a different angle, from a way that we may not have considered it before. And so he names from the start, this is Jesus. He's the faithful martyr, and he's the first one to get raised from the dead. And that means if you suffer for him, you are not without hope. If you take up your cross and follow him, he will not leave you behind. Third thing John says about Jesus is that he is the ruler of the kings of the earth. This is important. My teacher at Asbury Seminary is a guy named Bob Mulholland. He's passed away now. He offered one of the most helpful frameworks for understanding this that I've ever encountered. I told one person before the service, you probably should just know that I'm plagiarizing Mulholland the whole time. I disagree with him on one or two things, but they're not big. Beautiful, scholarly, pastoral thing. But here's the thing. He helped us see that Revelation divides everything into two categories. Heaven and earth, New Jerusalem and fallen Babylon. The rulers of the kings of the earth, people like Caesar, are ruled over by the slaughtered lamb. John is very quick to put them in their place, isn't he? And then he goes on to describe the work of Jesus. This is who he is and what he does. He's the one who loves us, who's freed us from our sins by his blood, and has made us to be a kingdom and priests to serve his God and Father. So you've got the kings of the rulers of the earth, and a kingdom of priests. Kings of the earth, kingdom of priests. So later on, as we read through it, we'll read about certain figures that are cast out to the earth. That means that they are associated with that rebellious realm, fallen Babylon. They're not associated with the realm of the Lamb slain. That's the New Jerusalem. That's the heavenly realm. And it's not like we got to escape this world to get up there. That's not the point of that distinction. Because by the end of the story, the Lamb makes his home on the earth and everything is made new. He's the light of the world. And this earth becomes a garden once again. The point is, all the way through, Revelation is asking us, are you aligning yourself in your posture, in your perspectives, in your heart, in your behavior in the world? Are you aligning yourself with the kings of the earth or with the Lamb who reigns on the throne of heaven? What does faithfulness to Jesus look like? That's the question when the rulers of the earth are mentioned. And you know who the rulers of the earth are. Watch the news. Make a list. And you know how they operate. Pay attention to the character that is embodied in the rulers of the earth. Pay attention to the behaviors that are practiced. And then ask, do those practices and attitudes and behaviors embody the character of the faithful martyr who was raised from the dead? Or not? Revelation invites us to ask, which realm are you a citizen of? Babylon or Jerusalem? Heaven or earth? The beast, the dragon, or the Lamb? Who is Jesus? He's the resurrected martyr who offered his life to free us from our sins by his blood, so that our postures, our attitudes, our worldview, our mindsets, and the way we live in the world can consistently honor him. John offers himself as something of a prototype. Here's what faithfulness looks like. Verse 9, I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos. He's in exile. Ancient historians tell us Patmos was a common place. If they didn't like you, that's where they sent you. Common place of exile. I'm your brother and your companion in suffering. And not only suffering, but the kingdom. Notice how those two things go together. And the patient endurance that are ours in Jesus. What's the posture of citizens of New Jerusalem, faithful to the Lamb, in a world marked by the ethics of Babylon? Be willing to lose something. Be committed to the kingdom. And be patient. You won't hear that much out there. There are very few voices that say, be willing to lose something and be patient. But if we're asking the question, what does faithfulness to Jesus look like? John says that's exactly what it looks like. Here's a guy who's willing to lose his home, his community, all of it, to go into solitude and exile. Why? Because of the Word of God and the testimony of Jesus. Revelation chapter 1 concludes with the words of Jesus himself. He says, first, write what you see on a scroll, send to the churches. He says, second, don't be afraid, which is good advice if you're getting ready to read about beasts. Don't be afraid. I'm the first and I'm the last, the living one. I was dead, now I'm alive. Of this lofty, beautiful image of Jesus. I hold the keys of death and Hades. So before you read about those seals and those riders and all the death and all the horror, know that he's in charge. And then the chapter closes with him walking amongst these lampstands. And we're told, here's the mystery. The lampstands are the churches. So the very first vision John has of Jesus, it's about Jesus. The very first vision he has of Jesus in chapter 1 of Revelation is Jesus in fellowship with his church. He is walking among his people and dwelling among them. We're going to find out in the next 2 chapters that sometimes he has words of encouragement and comfort, and other times it's what we might call tough love. He's going to chastise them a little bit, but it's because he wants them to be what? Faithful. What does it teach me about Jesus? And what does it teach me about faithfulness to Jesus, whether I live in the 1st century in Ephesus or the 21st century in Birmingham, Alabama? The question of revelation is always the question of allegiance. As we read this document together over the course of the next several months, we will again and again and again be faced with the question of allegiance. To whom will I be faithful? This afternoon when I get home, tomorrow when I go to work, will my colleagues see my life embody freedom from sin by the power of his blood? Will my classmates see me embody faithfulness to Jesus? My children, my spouse, my team, my neighbors, the nations. Again and again and again. And we will find that no aspect of our lives is left untouched by these questions. Everything will be overturned by the Lamb who stands in the center of the throne.